Okay, great. Well, thank you so much. Wow, what a great group you are. Thank you so much for coming out. Do you all live at Laguna Woods? Yeah, I see this and I see this. Okay, so yes and no. All right. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit this morning about my background. I am a clairvoyant. I'm a medium, a psychic and a medium. I'm going to talk about writing this book about near-death experience after effects, what drove me to write the book. And I'm going to talk about spiritually transformative experiences, some of the cases in the book. And I want to save time for questions, because I'm sure many of you have questions. But let me just start off by asking, how many of you have had an extraordinary experience for which there's no explanation? Yeah, a lot of people. So the truth is, thank you. The truth is a lot of people have these experiences, but not many people talk about them because they don't want anyone to think that they're crazy. They don't want to be ridiculed or embarrassed. It's just not something that you talk about, but they're actually quite common. So let me start off by telling you a little bit about myself. I am a psychic and a medium, and I don't know what the typical psychic and medium is like, but I'm pretty sure I'm not it. So my background is as a money manager. I was a money manager on Wall Street for many years. And when I was in the investment business, I always knew things. And I didn't know how I knew things, but, in the investment business, you have to do a lot of reading. Were any of you in the investment business? Yeah, I think a few of you. So there's a lot of reading, and, they would drop off stacks of annual reports and prospectuses on my desk. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Without even picking them up, I would know about the company. I would know about the management. I would know about the industry. I would know about the product. And I never really understood how that was possible. And of course, in the investment business, they don't talk about being psychic. It's just nothing that ever comes up in the investment business. So it's a dollars and cents business. So I just really didn't understand. But my boss used to say to me, Debra, you have good instincts. And I thought, yeah, I guess I just have good instincts. I didn't know what it was. Well, in 2008, I decided to take an intuition development class in New York. I live in Baltimore, but I decided I would take this class in New York. It was a weekend class. And I thought it would be fun because I figured I had good intuition. It would be fun to learn a few tools to tune it up. So I went up to New York for this class. There were about 25 people in the class. They looked much like you all, men and women. I didn't know any of them. And we did a few exercises Saturday morning, and I was getting everything. They were low-key exercises. We did some psychometry. Do people know what psychometry is? It's physical mediumship. Everything contains energy. This microphone contains energy. Everything contains energy. And you can actually do psychic readings off of physical objects. I could do a psychic reading on, somebody could do a psychic reading on my watch because I wear it all the time. It contains my energy. So we were doing some exercises, and as I said, I was getting everything, and I didn't really understand it, but it was pretty low-key, and I didn't think too much about it. And then we took a break. And after the break, we came back, and the teacher said, now we're going to do a seance. And I was like, no, that was not what I came for. I didn't want to do a seance. And then I thought, well, it was still Saturday morning. This class was going on until Sunday afternoon. And, nothing was going to happen anyway. Right, why not? So the teacher said, I'll put you in a meditative state, and then I'll take you out of it. And if you see anything, you let me know, and I'll tell you what to do. So I meditated. She took us out of the meditation, and she said, does anyone see anything? And I looked around the room, and everyone was looking at everyone else, and I raised my hand, and she said, yes, Debra, what do you see? And I said, I see about 50 people. So I was seeing people who were from my family who had passed over. I was seeing people who went with the people in the room. I didn't know any of the people in the room, but they were later identified by some of the people in the room. And then I was seeing random people. For instance, I saw some 42nd Street showgirls sort of walking through the room because we're near Times Square. So I was overwhelmed. I was frightened. The teacher said, well, if you see someone, for instance, in the corner of the room, that means they probably go with someone sitting in that corner. So I said, well, I do see someone in the corner, and I described him, and he was Hispanic. He had long dark hair, part in the middle, a handlebar mustache, and big white teeth. And as I described him, the woman sitting in that corner said, I can identify him. That was my fiancé. He died 2 years ago. And the woman in the corner said, if I show you pictures on my cell phone of my fiancé, will you be able to identify him? And I said, sure, because he was as clear to me as you all are. So during the break, she flipped through her cell phone, and I said, there, that's him. And she said, that's right, that's my fiancé. And he died 2 years ago. Now, she believed in all of this, and I had never met anybody who believed in all this stuff, but she believed in all this, and she had wanted to hear from him, but had not. So she was very grateful to me for making this connection, and she thanked me, and she gave me a big hug. Now, I used to work on Wall Street. There are no thank yous on Wall Street, and no hugs either. So, it wasn't lost on me that I had done something meaningful for someone. I was, I really had to think about this. This was profound. The rest of the weekend, I stayed in the class, we did more exercises. Sunday night, and by the way, I felt absolutely like I'd been run over by a truck by Sunday night. If you've never done energy work before and all of a sudden you introduce it to your body, it's like the first time you go to the gym, it just overwhelms you. So, but anyway, Sunday night I drove back to Baltimore and I called one of my sons. I have 3 sons, but this particular son scores high in logic tests. So I called him and I explained to him what happened. And he didn't say a word, but when I was all done, he said, well, that makes sense. We're just energy, and the energy has to go somewhere. So that gave me a context. I was, not as frightened. I was still overwhelmed, but I was not as frightened because it gave me sort of a pseudo-scientific context for this. I still didn't tell anybody about what happened. I came back to Baltimore. I didn't tell anyone. Remember, I had been in the investment business. A lot of the people I knew were in the investment business. It's not the kind of thing you bring up when they say, what'd you do this weekend? So I didn't mention it. That summer, I decided to go out to Taos, New Mexico to paint. I'm also an artist, and I had been to Taos a number of times. Have any of you ever been to Taos? Yes. So you know what Taos is like. It's a kind of an extraordinary place. A lot of artists, a lot of writers, a lot of musicians, psychics, spiritual people. So I had been to Taos a number of times. I rented a place for 2 months to go out there to paint. And what happened was I didn't come back. And that's a very common theme in Taos. When you talk to the locals and you say, how long have you been here? They say, oh, I came for a weekend 20 years ago. So it's, it sticks. I mean, it either sticks or doesn't. So they say if the mountain loves you, you stay. And what happened when I was in Taos was I started to unpack this energy that Spirit had given me, and I started to work with it. And I relaxed about what happened. I mean, out there, I really didn't think anything about being a psychic, because in Taos, when someone says, what do you do? And you say, I'm a psychic, they say, oh, me too. So it's nothing. So, I started working with the energy. I started to give readings. I gave some workshops. And after a while, I was doing this work. Now, eventually, I came back to the East Coast. My family's on the East Coast. My boys are on the East Coast. And I came back thinking, that's the end of this now. I mean, I'm coming back to Baltimore. Baltimore's not like Taos. And I won't be doing any more of this work. But that's not what happened. You're probably wondering, when is she going to get to the part about the NDEs? So it's coming. So what happened was I came back, and I was approached by a woman who had a near-death experience at 39. She had a cardiac arrest in a Hopkins hospital. And she died, and she came back. And she's actually in the medical literature. And she asked if I'd do a reading for her. And I said yes. So I did that, and then she asked if I'd do a reading for her girlfriend, and then the girlfriend's mother wanted a reading, and then they wanted a workshop, and one thing led to another, and before you knew it, I was doing this work on the East Coast. Okay, here comes the part about the near-death after effects. So I was asked to do a reading for a pretty well-known, actually very well-known NDEer. Does everyone know the term NDE, near-death experiencer? In Washington, D.C. a number of years ago. And I read for this man. He had been struck by lightning, and he came back with unusual abilities. And when I read for him, I was seeing some very unusual symbols. Now, psychics see things in symbols. That's how we get information. I was seeing some very unusual symbols. And also, when I came back to Baltimore that night, I started thinking, what happened to him? Why does he have these powers? What's he supposed to do with them? What about other NDEers? What do they get? And how do they get it? So I Googled NDE after effects, and guess what I found out? There hadn't been any research done. So I decided, well, I guess I'll have to do the research. Now, the thing is, it's not that far-fetched because, remember, I used to be on Wall Street. I spent the first 10 years as a healthcare research analyst. And not only that, I always worked on companies that were so early stage, they weren't even cutting edge. So I had to do original research, and I was always, there's a term in the investment business called the bell cow. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it, bell cow. So bell cow is, they put a bell on one of the cows, and then the cow goes out into the field, and the rest of the herd follows it, and that's how they know where the herd is. So I was the bell cow. So I knew how to do this, I was used to doing this. So I decided I would do research onto near-death experience after effects, but I only wanted to do research on, I wanted to do research on everything, but I had to confine it to two types of after effects, cognitive and physiologic. Now, why did I confine it to those? Because many people come back from these experiences, either spiritually transformative experiences, which, by the way, is what I had, or NDEs, which is a subset of spiritually transformative experiences. Many of them come back from these experiences with a plethora of after effects, including a lot of spiritual and psychological after effects. Spiritual, they come back, they're more spiritual. They say, I'm more spiritual than I used to be. Well, I couldn't measure that, so I decided not to include that. There are people who say, I lost my fear of death. I couldn't measure that. I couldn't tell how much what their fear of death was before and after. 65 to 75% of people who have NDEs end up divorced. There is some research into that, but I didn't want to pursue that. I wanted to focus on the cognitive and physiologic aspects because those are irrefutable and they're demonstrable. So what do I mean by that? So in terms of cognitive after effects, there are people who have these experiences who come back with newfound musical abilities, artistic abilities, mathematical abilities. There's a woman in the book who gets quantum physics downloads. She has 32 bins of paper in her closet stuffed with these downloads. She sent some to me when I was working on the book. And she's a former hairdresser. So she has no, experience in any of this. There are people who come back with physiologic after effects, and those include enhanced vision, enhanced hearing, higher IQ. Marianne, are you here? No. One of the cases in the book, Marianne Murnau lives here. I don't know if anybody knows Marianne. You know Marianne Elizabeth. So she came back with enhanced IQ. Her IQ went from 123 to 145. Yeah, it's tested. It was tested before and after. So, that's what I mean by it's demonstrable, it's irrefutable. It's not the kind of thing where science can say, no, that really didn't happen. They're making it up. They're not making it up. So, let's see. There are people who come back with electrical sensitivity. Now, you don't have to be an NDEer to be electrically sensitive, but many, many people are. And spontaneous healing. Some of you probably know about Eben Alexander. I believe he spoke here. His is a case of spontaneous healing. He had bacterial meningitis and was healed from that. There are many cases of spontaneous healing. Anita Moorjani is, another person that people know of who was healed of cancer. But there are many cases. There's a case in the book of a person who lives not far from here who he lives in Bakersfield, who was cured of stage 4 cancer, and I'll talk about that a little bit. So these are the kinds of after effects that I was looking for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we found out through this research. Now, I decided when I did the research to interview all these folks and to give them questionnaires, because that's how you do traditional research. But I also decided to do readings on them, because I'm a psychic and a medium, and I thought maybe if I do a reading, I'll be able to see something that happened to them during their experience that physical science can't get to. Because right now, the way science measures near-death experiences is statistically. They give you a checklist of how many elements you encountered in the NDE. Did you go through a tunnel? Did you see a light? Did you have a life review? And you check off the boxes. And if you check off so many boxes, then they give you a score. Well, the bottom line is this is more than a statistical experience, and not everybody has every element. Some people have experienced very few elements but have rich experiences, and some people have many elements. But it's not just about the elements, even though that's really what's been glamorized by the media. And I understand why. It makes it visually interesting to have tunnels and light and fantastic landscapes. I mean, otherwise you're just having a bunch of talking heads talk about near-death experiences. So they put those elements in, but that's led to a lot of issues. One issue is a lot of the NDEers said to me, I didn't go through a tunnel. Was my experience valid? So, they were really worried, because they had been told that, you had the tunnel and the light is what this is about. So, in fact, near-death experiences are not just about those elements. There are 16 elements of the NDE according to science. But the way you define an NDE is if you come back transformed, unable to go back to your former life. You can't go back. It's impossible. And the NDEers will all tell you that their families say, who are you? We don't recognize you. And they don't recognize themselves. So it has a truly transformative effect on them. So anyway, I did readings on all these folks, and I found that in the readings, I went with them where they went on their NDEs. And I told them that they could all ask questions in the reading. I had questions that, obviously a lot of the questions couldn't be answered by a questionnaire. I could give them a questionnaire, but, a question like, who were the beings of light that I saw? If I give them a questionnaire, they don't know the answer to that, and I don't know the answer either. So, that's where a reading would come in. So I said, you guys can, put in, whatever questions you have, we'll also use those in the reading. So they all had two questions, the same questions. One was, why me? And the second one was, what's my mission? They all felt, and they all used the term mission. They didn't say, should I go back to school? What job should I take? They all used the word mission. They all felt like they had some mission to do here on Earth. Now, for some of them, they had been given missions in their NDE. But for others of them, they felt that they had been told a mission, but darned if they could remember what it was. So many of these NDEers come back and they will wander, go from place to place thinking the answer to this is right around the corner. They'll try new jobs. They, have a lot of changes in their lives and sometimes a lot of upheaval in search of the answers. Many of them also are told all the answers to the secrets of the universe, and then they come back and they don't remember them. And that was a question some of them asked. Why don't I remember everything I was told? So that's all discussed in the book. So let me just tell you about a couple of the cases. So there's a woman who was referred to me. She lives in Canada, and she was a documentary film producer. Excuse me. She's 32 years old. She was a documentary film producer. Can you still hear me? You can't? No, I don't know what happened. Okay. Hello? Can you hear me? Okay. So she was 32 years old. She was a documentary film producer. in Canada. And she contacted me and said she'd had an NDE. Now, she was very successful, a producer and a writer, and she was on a location shoot in Belgium. She was anorexic, and she died when she was in Belgium in her room. She had an out-of-body experience. She left her body. She went into a chapel, which was at the site of this film shoot. She, while out of body, looked around the chapel and thought, it's so peaceful in here. I'd like to just lie down, but I better not because everyone will look at me. So she then went back to her room, looked down on the bed, saw her body on the bed, and wondered who that was. She said she had no association with that at all. Could have been a piece of furniture. She was told all the answers to all the questions of the universe, she said, and she was told the answer is simplicity. She came back from her NDE and didn't talk about it for a year. She didn't know really what had happened. She thought about switching jobs. She thought about becoming a nurse. She wanted to be of service, and she wasn't afraid of death anymore. But she didn't go back to school to be a nurse. Now, she went to visit a friend of hers about a year after her NDE, and this friend's girlfriend had a harp. And now this woman did not play any musical instruments. But when her friend would go to work, she'd take this harp out of the closet and she'd take it outside. She began to play. And every day when her friend went to work, she would take the harp out and play the harp. And after a week, she said, what am I going to do when I go back to Montreal because I don't have a harp? And she decided, well, I'll give myself 2 weeks when I get back, and if I still have the desire for this harp, then I'll figure it out. So the 2 weeks were up, and she still had this desire for the harp, and she described it to me as being a strong physical desire. She said that vibration of the harp, she knew that vibration. She said it was the vibration of her NDE. She said it was a very soothing, loving vibration. So it's powerful. So she decided she had to buy a harp. So she went on, I think, Craigslist. She looked for a harp. She found one for $2,000. Only thing was, she didn't have the $2,000. Now, she had been in contact with the woman selling the harp, and she called the woman and said, I'm very sorry, but I won't be able to buy the harp. The next day, this woman, the experiencer, got a call from a production company, and they said, did you get the check? And she said, what check? And they said, the check for the production. And she said, well, you already paid me. And they said, no, there's another check coming. We forgot. We owe you another $2,000. So she had the $2,000. She went and she bought the harp. She brought the harp back to her apartment and put it in her living room and sat and stared at it because, remember, she didn't have any training. She didn't know what she was going to do with this harp. So she went online and she started Googling harp. And every day she would Google, and really nothing much was coming up. And then one night she Googled harp, and the very last entry at the bottom of the page was harp thanatologist. Does anybody know what that is? Playing the harp bedside for hospice patients. Hi. So she said she read that, and she started to cry because then it all made sense. So she decided this is what she was going to do. So she had to take lessons to be a harp thanatologist. There was a woman in Philadelphia teaching harp thanatology. But again, this woman didn't have the money for the lessons. So the next thing that happened was she got a tax refund. She said she'd never gotten a tax refund in her life, but she got a tax refund for the exact amount of money of the lessons. So she went to Philadelphia to take the lessons, and she said the first thing that the teacher said when the lesson started was, remember, this work is all about simplicity. Remember, that's what she was told in her NDE. So this woman now is a harp thanatologist, and there does indeed seem to be a link between music and mission for many people, because music is all about resonance. The harp in particular is extremely resonant because it's such a big instrument. There's another individual in the book who's a New Age musician who had an NDE when they were a teenager. the day in an accident. The day after the NDE, they went out, they sold everything they owned and went out and bought a lot of musical equipment, sound synthesizers, all sorts of things. And this person is now a well-known new age musician with hundreds of CDs. And the thing about the expression of these gifts and abilities is that it often expresses itself as a compulsion. So many of these people who have these artistic or musical abilities or the mathematical abilities find they can't turn it off. It just doesn't stop. Because, in effect, these people are open now to the universe. And they can't shut it's like their back door's open. They can't shut it. So the information comes constantly. There was a man I spoke to when I was doing research who did not have an NDE. He wanted to be in the book. He's a new age musician in San Francisco. And he told me about how he had recently been trying to compose a song about being in God's heart. And he said he sat down at his synthesizer on a Monday, and he meditated on God's heart, and nothing came. And he tried all week, and nothing came. And then the second week he started again, and he tried, and nothing came. And I was thinking about how different that is than the NDEers, the person in the book who's the New Age musician, does a concert and immediately runs back to their studio to go make more music. They can't stop. There's a individual in the book who's an artist. He used to be the CEO of a not-for-profit in Mexico. He's a geologist. And he came down with dengue fever in Mexico, and then on top of that, he got encephalitis and meningitis. And he was airlifted to a CDC hospital in Atlanta. And at the hospital, his wife said to the doctors, what's his prognosis? And the doctor said, we don't know. We've never seen another case like this. So he had an NDE while he was at the hospital. He came back as a shamanic artist. And I did meet him, and he said to me, this is not me. This is not what I do. Now what happens is when he goes to sleep at night, he gets downloads of these images. And in the morning, he gets up and he goes down to his basement, and people bring him materials, and he stores them in his basement. He goes down to his basement, and he assembles these materials into various installations, and he makes paintings and whatnot. And he'll do that for 5 or 6 months at a time. He'll work on 5 or 6 pieces at a time, 5 or 6 months at a time, until he burns down the energy. And then he stops, and then the energy builds back up again. He has to start all over again. It's not as great as it sounds. I mean, people have said to me, how can I have one of those NDEs? That sounds so great. This will stimulate my latent abilities. And, the thing is, you don't really have control over your life anymore. And this is just one example. So now these people are also, because their back door is open, many of them are psychic and mediumistic, and they know what other people are thinking. Complete strangers. They know what other people are feeling. A lot of NDEers are unable to watch the news because they find it too distressing. Many of them are sensitive to light, to heat, to chemicals. They can't take pharmaceuticals, many of them. There's a fellow in the book, Robert Baer, who was actually a cop in South Central LA, not far from here. He was in the riot squad, so he used to beat people and gas people. Okay, he was not a very nice guy. And he had a physical, and everything checked out great, and then he went to visit his son in Phoenix. And he had a lovely time with his son. He was there for a week. At the end of the week, his son drove him to the airport. Robert said his goodbyes and thanked his son for a lovely time. He went into the airport, and he said he didn't feel well. So he said, but he decided to John Wayne it, and he made it onto the plane, and he dropped dead. So now there were paramedics on the plane, and they revived him. But while he was dead, he did have an NDE. And while he had his NDE, he had a life review, and he saw what his co-workers said about him behind his back, and he said it wasn't very nice. And he came back and he said, I only want to do good, and I mean it. And if you talk to him, he is the nicest guy. And he now lives in Oregon, and he writes grants for not-for-profits, unwed mothers. He coaches Little League in his little town in Oregon. So anyway, he'd had a physical before his NDE. He had his eyesight, his vision checked. And his vision was 20/90. Now, he was actually in a program on, I believe, the Discovery Channel after his NDE, and they wanted him to have a physical and have his eyesight checked again to confirm that, all these things had happened. So he had his eyesight checked again, and now his eyesight is 20/10. So it's better than perfect vision. It's 5 years now, and it's still going strong. So, when we talk about enhanced vision, some of these folks come back with vision that's not only better, but it's better than perfect. I'll tell you one more story about this is a kind of a funny story. I don't know if any of you know who Penny Sartori is, but she's a nurse in the UK. She wrote a book about near-death experiences with Pim van Lommel. Does anybody know who Pim van Lommel? You know who Pim van Lommel is. So Pim van Lommel actually endorsed this book. Pim van Lommel is a well-known cardiologist in the Netherlands and one of the leading scientists in the NDE field. So, and researchers in consciousness. So I had been communicating with Penny through email when I was writing this book, and one day Penny wrote me and she said, I know a man who has the types of after effects that you're referring to, and here's his website. And she sent me his website, and I Googled him, and I looked at his picture, and I realized, oh my God, he's the cashier from Sid's. Does anybody know Sid's in Taos? The grocery store. So I knew him. At this point, I was living in Baltimore. He was in Taos, but I knew him. So I emailed him. He had enhanced hearing. So I emailed him, and he said, oh, yeah, I know you. I wasn't friends with him, but I knew him from grocery shopping there. So now what happened with him was he had an NDE when he was in his late teens. He was in a bicycle accident, a lot of trauma. And he had his NDE. He came back and he found out about his enhanced hearing. He was in Boston, living in Boston. He came home from work one day and he heard this high-pitched sound. And he had to track it down. And it turned out there was a box in a closet that had an alarm system. The only thing was the alarm system hadn't been armed yet. But he was already picking this up. So he then found out when he moved to Taos and he was working at Sid's that he could hear conversations in the back of the store. And it's a pretty large store, so he would hear conversations in the back of the store. There are also people, there's a husband and wife team who are both NDEers, who both have enhanced hearing, and when they travel, this is how they can communicate with each other. So there are people who hear things from down the street, the apartment complex, over there, and in Ken Ebert's case, across, in the back of the store. So I guess, one thing when I had done all this research and I put it all together, I thought, what do all these NDEers, what are they trying to tell me? What do they have in common? Well, they all came back with their energy altered. And something happened to them, when they had this experience. And to have this experience, by the way, you don't have to have trauma to have an NDE. While it's often the case that there's an automobile accident or a drowning or surgery, that's not always the case. What happens, though, is your consciousness does have to be flung out of your body. So it can happen without the trauma involved. But when your consciousness is thrown out of your body, wherever it goes, it's being altered by universal consciousness. And these people come back with their consciousness or their energy altered. Now, everybody has consciousness. Some people have more consciousness than others, and some don't appear to have any. But the NDEers come back with too much consciousness, so they're just overloaded with consciousness. And this is why some of them are psychic, some are mediumistic, and some of them have they don't know what to do with this, this extra consciousness that they have. We're not really wired for this. While NDEs sound like a fantastic experience, they're not really you're not meant to come back to Earth, I don't think, with all this extra consciousness. We are mostly physical bodies on a physically dense Earth. So enhanced energy was something that was, clearly a byproduct. I'll tell you one more case about the man I had mentioned earlier who is in Bakersfield. So Dr. Rajiv Parti was chief of cardiac anesthesiology in Bakersfield at Bakersfield Heart Hospital. And he was your typical hard-charging physician. He would drive to work at 6 in the morning in his Hummer or his sports Mercedes. If somebody tried to cut him off, he'd go after them. He'd be on the phone with his stockbroker or the ER nurse or the OR nurse. And he was pretty, tightly wired. One day he was at home with his wife. Oh, by the way, he and his wife lived in a 15,000 square foot house. It was so big they needed cell phones to find the kids. So one day he was at home with his wife. He got a call from his doctor, and his doctor said, I have some bad news for you. You have cancer. He had prostate cancer. So Dr. Parti had 6 surgeries. At the end of the 6th surgery, he still had cancer. He was now addicted to pain pills. He was depressed. He was on depression medication, and he still had cancer. They were going to operate the 7th time when sepsis set in, and he had to be ambulanced to the UCLA Medical Center, where he had an NDE on the operating table. While he was on the operating table, he saw his mother and his sister in India. He's from India. His mother and his sister in India drinking tea. His mother wearing a red sari, and his sister wearing a green shirt and blue jeans. And 2 days later, he spoke with his mother, and she confirmed that, in fact, they had been doing that at that time, dressed the way he described them. So, how do you explain that? I mean, science says, these are delusions, these are hallucinations, this is hypoxia of the brain. I think science has some explanation, some explaining to do, because their explanations don't answer how your consciousness is able to be out of your body and know all and see all and be anywhere. But that's in fact what appears to happen. That, our essence, remember what I said at the beginning when I called my son, he said, we're just energy. The energy has to go somewhere. So our essence, the energy, the battery that is us, continues to live. And our physical body, when we pass, our physical body we discard, but that essence, that energy that is us, continues to live, and it can be anywhere and everywhere. And this is how NDEers are able to, when they're out of their body, know things they shouldn't be able to know and be places they shouldn't be able to be. These are called veridical experiences. Veridical experience from the Latin, verid is truth. These are experiences that are truthful that you shouldn't be, that you can't prove, but they are truthful. So NDEers have these experiences. Their consciousness, once it's free of your physical body, can exist in the universe and is all-knowing and is of no time and no space. It's a very hard concept for people to grasp. So anyway, after Dr. Parti's NDE, a few days later, he was cured of sepsis, he was cured of cancer, he was cured of his pain pill addiction, and he was cured of depression. He sold his 15,000 square foot house. He sold his Hummer and his Mercedes. He bought a Prius. He quit his medical practice. He's now a healer. So I met him in L.A. He came for a reading. I was in L.A. for a number of months doing research on the book, and he came for a reading. His is a case of spontaneous healing. I mentioned earlier there are cases of electrical sensitivity. Are any of you here electrically sensitive? Do you know what I mean by that? You cause electronics to malfunction. Maybe you can't wear a watch. Okay. Cell phones sometimes don't work. You scramble a cell phone. You don't have to be an NDE or to be electrically sensitive. Many people who are spiritually connected can be electrically sensitive. Many people who've had a spiritual event, a spiritually transformative event, but not necessarily an NDE, come back sensitive to electricity. It's an issue because I had something like this happen to me recently, big time, and I was in the Yucatan doing readings. these. I don't know if any of you have ever been to the Yucatan doing readings at the Mayan sites, and something happened to me. And when I came back, I was basically shutting down everything. I ended up in the hospital, and the doctor said they couldn't find anything wrong with me. They put me on the stress test machine, and I blew out the machine. But they couldn't find anything wrong with me. So anyway, but you don't have to have an NDE to do that. Many NDEers are electrically sensitive, but they cause electronics to malfunction, and most of them don't wear watches anymore because they just die. So as a matter of fact, Ken Ebert, the fellow who works as the cashier at Sid's, told me he noticed he was wearing a watch and the watch died, and he had built an altar, so he put the watch on his altar, and he went out and bought another watch. And he wore that watch, and then that watch died. So he went to put it on his altar, and he noticed it died at the same time as the first watch. So he went out and bought a third watch, and that watch died also at the same time. At that point, he stopped buying watches. But it's pretty common. People who have this, they are interfering. Remember I said their energy's altered. So they're interfering with electricity. Now, we don't know what kind of energy these NDEers are carrying. We do know that it interferes with electromagnetic energy. Scientists haven't yet identified what kind of energy this is. We don't know.